your presentation very much. And the presentation, to my mind, is very much on legitimacy of global governments. And I totally agree to your implications, to your conclusions. But what about effectiveness of international and global institutions? So, okay, maybe the G20 are growing at the expense of the IMF, at the expense of UNCTAD and so on. But does the G20 become more effective than the others? Is this, in a way, a better system of rule? What is your opinion on that?
Shall I?
Yes.
Okay, well, I think you can disaggregate the idea of legitimacy of an organization, of a regime, international regime, into two categories. One of them is representativeness, and the other one is effectiveness. And you rightly said I stressed representativeness and not effectiveness. But just on the point about representation, to sharpen the point that I was making, what is happening is that the G20 countries meet and they decide on certain things amongst themselves. And then when those countries, the representatives of those countries, go to the boards of the IMF and the World Bank, those representatives from the G20 countries basically shut their ears. I'm exaggerating, but this is what they do when non-G20 countries speak at the board. They don't need to listen to what the non-G20 countries say because the non-G20 countries no longer count. And this makes at least some of the non-G20 countries really, really angry. This is not a kind of matter of let's get our formal procedures right. This is something that strikes visceral anger into representatives from quite a lot of non-G20 countries. The way that the G20 has come in as a superordinate authority and bypassed the representational system that has been established since the 1940s in these Bretton Woods organizations. And that this does make them very angry, to the point that when the Koreans, in the run-up to was it Seoul? Where was the G20 meeting in Korea? It was Seoul, yeah. The Seoul summit had formulated the development agenda for the G20 and asked the World Bank to assist in the formulation of the G20 development agenda to be agreed in Seoul. Some non-G20 executive directors on the board of the World Bank really made it their business to try and find out where in the budget of the bank the resources for helping the G20 process were being hidden. And the bank management did not want to tell them where the resources were being hidden. And the non-G20 people were saying, we don't want the bank to be helping the G20 process because that legitimizes the G20 process. We don't want the bank to be the secretariat of the G20 for development issues. So from the point, this may seem to you to be a really arcane kind of matter, a little matter in a teacup, but from the point of view of the people engaged, these are really emotionally very, very hot issues. On the effectiveness, I've written a lot also about the effectiveness, or rather the non-effectiveness of the G20 by taking the G20's own statements about what it has achieved since 2008, by taking their own statements and then making an assessment. For example, the assessment of Basel III Capital Accord, the assessment of the voice reforms in the Bretton Woods organizations, which the G20 claim to have engineered, and so on. So again, I have a paper setting out this assessment. And you just can't say that the G20 has been an effective steering committee for the world economy. You can say that it was an effective crisis committee, but once the crisis somewhat abated in 2009, the G20 elevated itself to be the steering committee of the world economy. It elevated itself. That's what makes the non-G20 countries on the boards of the Bretton Woods Organization so angry, that this is a sort of coup d'etat. So you can't say, if you look at what the G20 has achieved, what it has agreed, it's a mixed picture, but it's nothing like the kind of success that the G20 champions, who just not coincidentally are the G20 countries, especially the G7, what they claim.
I'm Ben White from Victoria University of London.
So am I, by the way.
This is a kind of invitation to speculate a little, and away slightly from issues of representation towards issues of policy. And I guess I have in the back of my mind that the last time when people started getting excited about developing countries having a little bit more impact on global governance, which is back in the 70s with the new international economic order movement. And at that point, the developing countries seem to have forged some form of common agenda around particularly commodity prices. And I just wondered if you could imagine an alternative universe in which China and the BRICS link up with the rest of the G20, G77 to promote some sort of development policy agenda. What would you like that to be? Do you think there's any common interest at all that could be built between middle-income countries and low-income countries anymore? Or do you think their differences are too great for that to be possible?
Oh boy.
It's a mean counterfactual question, but the idea was, if we're complaining about governance now, what might we like it to look like?
Well, there are a whole set of issues about the global financial architecture on matters, for example, of exchange rates, the governance of exchange rates. The current system, or rather non-system, of exchange rate, the market for exchange rates, the volatility that this produces, dragging resources into certain sectors and economies one minute and then dragging them out the next because of speculators in New York and London. I exaggerate again, but I mean that's the situation, that's broadly the situation we're in. We have a very detailed set of rules about trade and productive investment, but we have no such regime for coordinating exchange rate movements. There are quite a number of issues of that general kind where you would think that there could be a common interest amongst developing countries, but the fact of the matter is, as I said at the end, that the G77 plus China is just in disarray. It's the weakest it has been for many decades, as the leading countries, developing countries that could coordinate, basically have walked away from that kind of forum and into the G20 process, where they're sitting at the table with the big boys.
Well, I'm very interested in what my compatriot Robert Wade has been saying around the G20. For my sins, I have, since France took the presidency of the G20, been attending the finance ministers' meetings representing the UN. And the G20 has had a somewhat ambivalent attitude towards the UN, it's fair to say. But we have felt it's important to build and maintain a relationship because the G20 is a fact, it meets, but it has no permanent secretariat, it has no executive authority independent to the institution, and so anything it pronounces on which is worthwhile, it has to go to somebody to try and get implemented. So we've believe that it's important to endeavour to have some influence on that agenda. But some of the points that Robert's made about its impact with respect to G77 plus China, I think are quite interesting, because obviously most of the world's countries are not at the G20 and not remotely represented. At the outset, there was a seat for NEPAD, the new Economic Partnership for African Development. That may have morphed into an AU seat post Colonel Gaddafi's chairmanship of the AU. But that's one voice for a rather large continent, apart from that of South Africa. And generally, ASEAN gets a seat, but it's very much at the whim of whoever chairs the organisation. But I think Robert is right to say that it's raised a lot of issues at say IMF and World Bank as to who sets their agenda, because when you have such a concentration of voting power on these organisations meeting in another forum and then in effect setting a work program for those Bretton Woods institutions, what does that then mean for the governance of those institutions, the International Finance and Monetary Committee of the IMF, etc. So there's some quite interesting issues around that. The other thing from a UN perspective which I've observed is that the G20, as Robert made clear, has its origins in a meeting of finance ministers. And then with the global financial and economic crisis, it convened at George W. Bush's instigation in late 2008 at the leader level and has continued at that level. But it's continued the legacy, if you like, of being finance ministry oriented in origin. Now, finance ministers in general have very little orientation towards the United Nations at all. And so even in countries which are very well disposed towards the UN, the people who tend to be participating in these processes are not part of that orientation in their countries. They're much more oriented to going to World Bank IMF meetings. And so there tends to be a question of, well, what is the relevance of the UN here? Why are we bothering with it at all? Which is why it took so long for UN to get representation on the finance ministers' meetings. And I think if it hadn't been that I had a past as a head of government in a certain status, it might not have been possible at all, which is unfortunate, because it shouldn't relate to an individual. It should relate to the credibility of the institution. But having started at leader level as a summit born out of crisis, and having been mobilised by the United Kingdom to respond in April 2009 with the $1 trillion package, etc. I think it's one thing to get the G20 on one page in the height of a crisis on the basis that if we don't stand together, we sink together. But since then, it's been hard for it to get broad agreement on substantive issues. People have gone back to their corners, and there is the framework for balanced and sustainable growth, which they've issued, which implies a certain amount of peer review. But of course, if you were to get some greater convergence, if you are to get the countries with the huge current account surpluses to become more consumers and the ones who are more debt-laden to become better savers, that requires national action. And national action isn't so easy if you're the US president with a Congress which isn't completely on board with you. If you're the German government with a deep history of fear of debt and wayward spending. So, we see a lot of discussion about savers becoming spenders and spenders becoming savers, but it's easier said than done. So one observes all these debates at the G20 finance ministers meeting and how it's then interacting on relationships with the broader international system, not just the international financial institutions, but also the UN system itself. But for me, observing it and participating, if you like, at the fringes representing the UN, I found it quite strikingly different from APEC. And I went to APEC summits, 8 consecutive APEC summits. And while APEC had an economic orientation, it was a gathering of 21 economies, which to this day includes Taiwan and Hong Kong, nonetheless, the summits were very much geopolitical summits which were informed by a country's geopolitical positioning rather than the economic positioning. That isn't the case at the G20 so much. It really is driven up through this finance minister stream, and that...
Even at heads of government
yes,
level.
Even at heads of government level, the Sherpas tend to be oriented in that way. And it has found it hard to grow its agenda. For example, climate change is not accepted as part of its agenda because developing countries say, and I think there's considerable merit in this, that there is a UN body which deals with climate change and negotiations. So a lot of issues have been off the agenda. So where this all goes is very much a moot point. It is informal multilateralism, but it has, as Robert said, had a certain ability to sway agendas and work programs in the Bretton Woods institutions. And from the point of view of the UN, representing all member states, we feel we have to be part of that networking with informal multilateralism, and also to be raising a card for the many who don't sit at the table, developed and developing. Some of the most passionate voices on this subject will be heard from the countries like Norway and others. And there was a 3Gs group which started at the UN. Singapore played a very constructive role in convening the Norways, New Zealands and others, developed and developing, 3Gs global governance group, to say, well, there are things being discussed at the G20 which have spillover effects for us. So we would rather like the UN to be carrying some of our messages as well. So that's just some reflections. But listening to President Obama at the Pittsburgh summit in 2009, summing up, he was very specific in the language he used. He said, we are agreed that we see, this is speaking for the member state participants in the organisation, we see the G20 as our premier vehicle for economic cooperation. This so easily morphs into the premier forum for economic cooperation. And I think it's very important to make that distinction between our and the. Because if it's the, then everybody else feels excluded and marginalised by a very powerful group of economies with clearly dominant weight in the IFIs steering the direction and programme.
One last question for Chris.
Thank you. Just a passing observation on what Helen said about finance ministers. I suppose I much maligned Gordon Brown might be an exception to this rule of lack of interest in international development issues. I found Robert's analysis extremely helpful and persuasive, and I sympathise with his cri de coeur, but it comes to something when you have a nostalgia for the Bretton Woods organisation, being so often criticised as the source of injustice in the world and so on. Now, if you've got an international system which to some extent is not working for the have-nots, what's going to happen? I mean, if you think about the history of revolution in a way, I mean, it's going to come from the bottom up. So it's either going to come from the street, and you could say that arguably the Arab Spring is as much about economic unrest and unhappiness as it is about democracy and so on. That's one side of it. But clearly there are limits to what the street can do, so it's going to be governments or the have-not governments. And if you look back over the last 30 or 40 years, I suppose, there's been a history of rather sort of strange, semi-spontaneous outcrops of new organisations coming up from the bottom, whether they're regional like ASEAN or they're commodity-based like the Cairns Group or OPEC was a very, I know OPEC was also very rich oil-producing countries, but still it was a challenge to the existing order. And one could argue that it's not the Bretton Woods system or the G20 which is going to be the way in which governments and peoples that feel excluded from the system are going to operate, but they're going to find ways, either regional or commodity-based or things yet to be imagined, which will spring up in the international system to drive new modalities.
Actually, I very much agree. If I had had 30 minutes rather than 20 minutes, I would have talked about what I think is a really interesting and also promising trend, which is towards let's say, a greater diversity, a greater diversity of financial cross-country financial arrangements that have been constructed, especially since this crisis began. First of all, beginning with the East Asian crisis, when so many East Asian countries said, never again, we will never again put ourselves in the position of being in the embrace of the IMF. But also in Latin America, and also in the early stages in Africa. These two crises, the East Asian one and the current one, have driven a sort of proliferation of regional financial arrangements. One of the most interesting is the Chiang Mai Initiative, which was started in 1999 in the wake of the East Asian crisis, and which then in 2008 was expanded into the clunky name, very clunky name, Chiang Mai Initiative Multilateralization, or CMIM, which involves pooling of foreign exchange reserves up to a certain point amongst the ASEAN countries +3 to allow any one country to borrow from this pool so they don't have to borrow from the IMF. But the trouble is that the suspicions, the distrust between China and Japan are so strong that they could only make this thing go forward if they built in an IMF link such that if any country wants to borrow from this pool more than 20% of what it is entitled to by the rules, more than 20% of its total borrowing, that country must be under an IMF surveillance program, and the IMF must sign off on it borrowing from the Chiang Mai Initiative pool. And so, the reason is because both China and Japan distrust each other so much that if they worry that if the Chiang Mai Initiative puts conditions on a loan to, let's say, Thailand, then the other country, so China worries that if the Chiang Mai Initiative puts conditions on a loan to Thailand, Japan will come in with a bilateral loan to Thailand in order to undercut the conditions that China has signed off on to buy favor with the Thai government. That's the kind of worry that they have, and that's why they have outsourced their distrust, their suspicion, so to speak, to the IMF as the third party, thereby undercutting a great deal of the whole purpose of the Chiang Mai Initiative. And you see these tensions having erupted just in the last, within the last year, when it came to establishing a secretariat of the Chiang Mai Initiative. Singapore offered the building and the land, and then the question was, who is to be the president? Big, big issue. China put up a candidate, Japan put up a candidate, ASEAN put up a candidate, China and Japan vetoed the other candidate, so ASEAN was very happy, thinking that this would pave the way for the ASEAN candidate to be the first president. But in the end of the day, China got the first presidency. And then came the critical issue of what was the full name of this secretariat. The acronym was AMRO, ASEAN +3, and then what did the MRO stand for? Some people said it stood for Macroeconomic Research Organization, and other people very insistently said it stood for Macroeconomic and Research Organization, because these people who said there must be an and between macroeconomic and research wanted AMRO to have a strong surveillance role. And therefore they said macroeconomic, the word macroeconomic separated from research means that it is macroeconomic and research, not just macroeconomic research. And macroeconomic was the code word for surveillance. But surveillance meant things like China's exchange rate. And the Chinese were adamant that this organization was not going to do surveillance of China on such matters as China's exchange rate. And therefore, the Chinese vetoed the use of and between macroeconomic and research. So the official name now is ASEAN +3 Macroeconomic Research Organization. And the fact that the Chinese is the first president means that its surveillance and sort of peer review role will be downplayed, and it will be a sort of university-type think tank without any serious force. And so my point is, again, if any of you are looking for dissertation topics, this is a great one.
I think we're going to move on now to David Cameroon from Sciences Po in Paris, to add a different European, Australian
Yes, I hope people don't feel there's a kind of antipodean conspiracy occurring here. I mean, my ancestors were expelled from France 3.5 centuries ago, were for religious persecution reasons, and they were political refugees before moving to Australia in the 19th century. I'm a gastronomic refugee to France who claimed the family rights over 30 years ago. Many thanks for the organisers for this invitation. I'm really honoured to be in a symposium with Helen Clark, who I admire a great deal. The conversations on China in Europe often involve two groups who I'd loosely describe as the dragon bashers and the panda huggers. Okay? The dragon bashers and the panda huggers. Now, what I'm going to do is to try and take a Southeast Asian perspective, which I will call the perspective of the dragon huggers. Hugging dragons is not a very comfortable activity. I should say from the beginning that my presentation is based on a report prepared for a think tank called a research network called ECRAN, the Europe-China Research Network. It's an EU-supported project, and this report will come out in the next week or so, so you can download it. It will be available to be downloaded. The second thing is I've just returned from Myanmar, where I was able to observe the polling on the by-elections on the 1st of April in order to write a report for one of the candidates in the French presidential elections. I'm pleased to say the front-running candidate. Now, so what I'm going to say is a bit coloured by that experience in Myanmar, the closest neighbour in some ways to China, and certainly the country of Southeast Asia that, as one of the effects of Western sanctions, has been put firmly, at least up until recently, in China's embrace. What we see in Myanmar is in exacerbated form is the three challenges that are common to many Southeast Asian countries, to generalize. The first of these is to find forms of democratic governance or a democratic transition that accommodates specific political cultures, systems and traditions. You can see, for example, after the fall of Suharto in Indonesia, that it's taken maybe 14 years for us to now to be talking about some degree of stability in Indonesia, forms of decentralization. There's still a great deal of experimentation going on in Indonesia on forms of governments, and this is an ongoing process. The second challenge, which I think is common to many Southeast Asian countries, is establishing modes of governance that are appropriate to multi-ethnic societies and respectful of minority rights. And I think that when we talk about minority rights, the degree of their difficulty is related to three factors: ethnicity, religious identity, and sense of local rootedness. And when you have those three things together, as is the case in the peripheral areas of Myanmar, you have very difficult situations to resolve. And that is an enormous challenge. And the third challenge, which I think is exacerbated greatly in the Burmese case, is to find new forms of civilian-military relations. The military in Burma are not going to turn over and die. Let's not be naive. They will try and follow perhaps the path of their Thai, Indonesian, Vietnamese colleagues, and find new ways of protecting their interests, perhaps in civilian form, in other forms. But the question of civil-military relations is very clearly on the agenda. Political transitions, to return to a point that Helen made yesterday, are long, lengthy processes. In my own adopted country, France, I think it's fair to say that it took a century after the French Revolution to say that there will be no turning back. There will not be a return to a monarchical system. It takes a full century till the Loi Jules Ferry on state education, secular education, to the Concordat with the church. It took a century. So that to expect these transitions to somehow resolve the problems overnight is really quite, I think, naive. According to the latest opinion polls, the last would-be Napoleon in France should be metaphorically beheaded by the electorate, by French voters, on the 6th of May. But I do not want to take my desires for reality. Let me come back to the subject. If one is to find a simple metaphor for the relations between China and Southeast Asia, I think we should refer to the old cliches about mother-in-laws, okay? Wealthy mother-in-laws. There are three things about wealthy mother-in-laws. First of all, you had no choice in the relationship. It comes with the marriage or the neighborhood. Secondly, you are pleased with her existence. It's far better to have a wealthy mother-in-law than a poor mother-in-law. Okay? Will be dependent on you. And thirdly, you feel more sanguine and happier about the relationship the further you are away from living with her. And my research over my experience in now over 20 years in Southeast Asia seems to confirm that concerns about China, worries about China, diminish the further you get away. Hanoi, the greatest concern; Jakarta, the least concern. Now, if we wish to talk about the relations of the countries of Southeast Asia, and for that matter, their regional organization, ASEAN, founded in 1967, we need to look at the complexity of the two entities. China may be a single nation state, but it is at least three things. It can also be considered not only a nation state, but a region state or imperial construct in which the interrelationships of its domestic parts impacts on its relations with its southern neighbors. I refer to what Robert was talking about. We're seeing in political economy in relation to Southeast Asia a shifting of production, but no longer buying components from Southeast Asian companies, and for those components to be produced in the western part of China. There's some evidence of this occurring. And this is possibly because China is more than a small nation state. It's a question of size, but it's also, to some extent, also a region state or an imperial construct. Secondly, China is a regional actor in diverse regional contexts: Northeast Asia, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia, just to simply talk about the immediate neighborhood. And Southeast Asia amongst those three is merely one that requires the attention of the Chinese leadership. In interviews in Beijing, but also particularly interviews done by my sinologist colleagues, and I'm not one of them, in Beijing, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is far more important than our relations with ASEAN. The SCO, Beijing not only houses a secretariat and determines the agenda, the organization deals with issues of crucial importance for the Chinese regime, namely the control of secessionist movements on the borders, the integrity of borders, and access to the vast energy resources necessary to fuel the Chinese economy. And thirdly, as the second largest economy, China is also a global player in a multinodal world in which regional action in Southeast Asia is inscribed simply within that domestic foreign relations nexus. Now, if we turn, so we've got a multiple China, 3 dimensions to simplify, but we've also got a multiple Southeast Asia. As you all know, one of the most diverse regions in the contemporary world. Countries like Singapore with a GDP superior to that of most EU members, countries like Laos or Burma on the other extreme amongst the least developed countries in the United Nations. Thriving megacities such as Bangkok, Jakarta, and Singapore are juxtaposed with rural heartlands where some 70% of the population of Southeast Asia overall still lives. And the diversity is not merely economic. We have the 5 or 6 major religious and philosophical traditions: Buddhism, Christianity, Confucianism, Taoism, Hinduism, and Islam present. This will be a matter of only purely sociological significance, except that the belief systems impinge on the political cultures and politics of the 10 countries concerned, which go from absolute monarchies in Brunei to the present dysfunctional democratic system in Asia's first independent republic, the Philippines. And between these 2 extremes are soft authoritarian regimes such as Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, semi-democracies, Malaysia and Singapore, and assertive, if somewhat problematical, democracies such as Indonesia. There are also countries undergoing political evolution, such as Burma, Myanmar, and also Thailand. One of the things which is not being observed, for example, is the potential for some future crisis in Thailand after the demise of King Bhumipol. But if I said that in Thailand, I would be arrested for lèse-majesté state. Now, all of the countries, however, share a common challenge, dealing with a large northern neighbor. As John Fairbanks said, the only civilization to form itself a nation. This is the overriding geopolitical and geoeconomic challenge in Southeast Asia. Of course, this is not new. We've often talked about the sinocentrism of Chinese foreign relations, and there is now a resuscitation of talk of the tributary relations which characterized Imperial China's relations with the monarchs of various parts of what is today Southeast Asia, who acknowledged Chinese suzerainty by paying tribute to the Chinese emperor, and at the same time this allowed them the autonomy to get on with their own control in their own particular polities. Now, one way of interpreting China's relations with Southeast Asia today is to suggest there's a renewal of these types of tributary relations. This is the argument, for example, of David Kang in a book published in 2007. And indeed, if one looks at the pomp and pageantry that accompany the regular visits of Southeast Asian political leaders to Beijing, these are designed at best to stress fraternal relations and at worst subordination. Now, Chinese scholars today tend to stress that China has never been an expansionist power in Southeast Asia. The millennium of Chinese occupation of what is today northern Vietnam being the exception rather that proves the rule. So we have a stress in official Chinese rhetoric on the peaceful rise, a harmonious society, being a good neighbor. And there's a great deal of stress on what is called Chinese soft power. I think we need to unpackage Chinese soft power. We need to unpackage what soft power involves. It involves three things, soft power: attention, persuasion, and attraction. Now, it's clear that China's peaceful rise and increasing political and economic power has focused the attention of elites in Southeast Asia. But this has not been necessarily translated in an ability to persuade them to accept, for example, the so-called Beijing consensus, namely that illiberal governments are a prerequisite for economic growth. In fact, since the Asian economic crisis of 1997, we've seen political trajectories in Indonesia, Thailand, and today Myanmar, which are away from authoritarianism and towards liberalized regimes. And moreover, outside of the city-state of Singapore, where we have public intellectuals like Kishore Mahbubani, who vaunt the virtues of the Chinese model, there's not a great deal of attraction for the Chinese model. Not far below the surface in public opinion in Southeast Asia is a visceral, reflexive xenophobia, one fueled during the colonial period and today nurtured by dependence on or resentment towards the business elites of Chinese origin who are preeminent in most Southeast Asian economies. Remember that the most recent pogroms, anti-Chinese pogroms, occurred in Indonesia less than 15 years ago, in 1998. And anti-Chinese sentiment is periodically nurtured even today in Malaysia for political ends. So rather than think about a tributary relationship, I think we need to think in terms of what we could call asymmetrical relations between China and Southeast Asia. Now, if we talk about this and what I was called the dragon hugging that occurs from Southeast Asia, we can look at two expressions. One is from Burmese, puk pao, which can be translated as kinsfolk and implies a relationship between a younger sibling and his elder brother. And the second comes from maritime Southeast Asia, a concept developed by Indonesia's first Prime Minister, Muhammad Hatta, in 1947, that of medayung antara dua karang, which can loosely be translated as rowing between two reefs. Now, looking from Southeast Asia, what strikes me not so much is the strength of Chinese power, but its relative weakness. And what strikes me looking from Southeast Asia is not so much Chinese leadership, but the strategic followership of Southeast Asian political elites. And this has a long history. Siam, or today's Thailand, was the only country of Southeast Asia to remain independent. In the mid-19th century, King Mukut, faced with the French to the east and the British to the west, in Malaya and in Burma, said to his people, "We have a choice. We can swim up the river with the crocodile," that's the French, okay, Dominique Strauss-Kahn, or we can go out and swim with the whale to the sea, the whale being the British, of course. And he said to his people, what we need to do is to give up some of our privileges, i.e. we lose some of our territory, which was the case, get our own house in order. Mungkut and his son Chulalongkorn instituted a kind of Thai Meiji restoration, the modernization of Thailand, which assured Thailand's independence, or Siam's independence.
When was this?
Mungkut was being much maligned because he became the character for Hollywood's The King and I. Okay, so he looks rather debile in The King and I. In fact, he was a very astute. So this is 1847, okay, I think, or 1857. We must get our own house in order, give up some of our privileges, and in a sense play one against the other. The rowing between two reefs. Now, during the Cold War, this was not possible. Southeast Asia was divided between two hostile camps. It was unworkable, this strategy. My argument is that since the end of the Cold War, this strategy of rowing between two reefs has come to the fore again. So what we see is that and a second strategy reinforcing ASEAN as a regional organization, symbolized by the adoption of the ASEAN Charter in November 2007, which gives it for the first time a legal personality. And we also have the creation of an ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, which will lead to the establishment of an ASEAN Economic Community in 2015. Now, seen from Europe, ASEAN is seen as a very weak regional organization. It's a question of, do you see the glass half full or the glass half empty? I tend to see the ASEAN Charter as being important, that it is, for the first time, there are benchmarks about club membership. There is talk of human rights, there is talk of democracy within the ASEAN Charter. There are benchmarks. So I think that there is, and so that ASEAN has been able, by default, and Robert referred to this, the rivalry between China and Japan, ASEAN by default has remained in ASEAN jargon in the driver's seat, okay? Even if the mother-in-law is behind telling the driver perhaps where to go, to use my metaphor once again, as mother-in-laws often do in the back of cars. If we look at the economic dimension, and then I'll look at the political dimension, trade between China and Southeast Asia grew from about 8 billion euros in 1994 to 180 billion in 2008, falling slightly in 2009 as a result of the global financial crisis. Now, the overall figures, however, although the fact that the ASEAN countries globally have balanced trade with China, the overall figures hide quite significant discrepancies. The exporters of raw materials and energy sources, such as Indonesia and Laos, have trading surpluses. The exporters of components, such as Thailand and Malaysia, have trade deficits. And also, this China-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement allowed for what was called an early harvest for the poorer countries of Southeast Asia as a sweetener for the trade deal. However, since 2010, trade flows actually shifting to China's benefit. Now, China has also become an important investor in Southeast Asia, with 38 billion euros of investment in 2008. However, to relativize this represents only 2.6% of Chinese total stock of investment overseas. Moreover, 80% of those investments are in Singapore. This is also the case actually for the European Union. When we talk about investment in ASEAN, 2/3 of that investment is in Singapore. So this investment in Singapore is in financial services largely. Investment outside this area is designed above all to meet the needs of the Chinese domestic market. This is the case for dam building in Laos, Cambodia and Myanmar, designed to provide electricity for the Chinese market. And unlike the Japanese, and this is the point that Rob was making, the Chinese have not yet developed vertical production networks in Southeast Asia. Now this, for the middle-income Southeast Asian countries, notably Malaysia and Thailand, is a serious long-term worry. Okay? The Japanese, when they invested in Thailand, say in the automobile industry, brought in their major manufacturers, but also all the subcontractors. So everything was being produced, except for a couple of components in Thailand. This is not the case for Chinese investment. It's about having access to some components. And what there is some evidence of, that Robert also alluded to, is there's a shift to producing those components now within China itself. And so the imports from these countries will find themselves in competition with domestically produced components. China's contribution to de facto economic regionalization, to use the jargon of comparative regionalism, are having the effect, actually, of dividing ASEAN between its mainland members and its island members. Propelled by the Chinese government and with the support of the Japanese-led and Western-financed Asian Development Bank, the greater Mekong sub-region has become the most dynamic part of Southeast Asia. Normally, its membership includes Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, as well as the two southern Chinese provinces of Yunnan and Guangxi. The ADB has contributed a third of approximately $11 billion in investment since 2000, infrastructure investment. The lion's share of the remainder comes from China. In Myanmar alone in 2010, the Chinese invested some $8 billion in oil, gas and hydropower and had agreed to $80 billion in investment projects in Cambodia. So these forms of economic integration will see mainland Southeast Asia, along with Yunnan and Guangxi, served by a Chinese-sponsored integrated network of high-speed rail networks, pipelines and highways by 2020. Now, certainly there is a plus for the countries of Southeast Asia. But actually, when you look at where those pipelines, high-speed rail systems, and highways are being established, they are in the poorer areas and the least developed areas of Southeast Asia, and they are designed to provide new openings for Chinese trade outside of Southeast Asia. The pipelines coming across Myanmar into the Bay of Bengal are designed very logically and quite rationally to allow China to import its oil from the Middle East without being forced to bring it around the Straits of Malacca and through the South China Seas. So, turning to the political dimension, China has... time to finish. Okay, very rapidly. Okay. When we look at China's impact on de jure regionalization, while China has a privileged position in relation to Southeast Asia in the ASEAN Plus 3 forum, this position has to be shared with Korea and Japan. Another example of the hedging strategy of the southern neighbors. ASEAN Plus 3 was enlarged in 2005 to add India, Australia and New Zealand, the East Asia Summit, hedging once again, in which, and then in 2011 enlarged further to include the United States and Russia, a further example of the hedging strategy of the countries of Southeast Asia. So, while we may talk in China about the emergence of the concept of Tianxia, all under one heaven, Chinese foreign relations discourse at the multilateral level expresses the idea of a harmonious society, but on the ground we are seeing, first of all, problems in the South China Sea. Just last week there was a standoff between the Philippine Navy and the Chinese Navy over fishing and fishing grounds. I'm far more concerned about what is occurring in the Mekong and the Irrawaddy and the potential of conflict over water resources, because these impact far more on the peoples of Southeast Asia. To conclude, when one talks with political leaders in Southeast Asia, they express two concerns. There's a trust for the present regime and the stability that it seems to enjoy. But there is a concern about rising Chinese nationalism. And there's a fear, for example, the meeting I had with ASEAN ambassadors in Paris, where they talked about the blogging of Chinese young people on the net in China is exacerbating nationalist sentiment, and that the regime, in order to maintain its legitimacy at some point, may have to act on that. The other concern they express is the People's Liberation Army, in relation to the South China Sea, is a political force in its own right. Now, I'm a firm believer in the Marxist view of history, not the Marxist view of Karl Marx, but that of Groucho Marx. The Groucho Marx view of history is that when a blunder will happen, it will happen. So I'm far more concerned about a blunder in the South China Sea rather than a deliberate attempt at provocation. Thank you.
Do we have some questions?
Just briefly, because I know we have one more important speaker to come, but having been PM in New Zealand for 9 years through some of these very interesting developments, I was reflecting on whether New Zealand could be described as in the dragon hugger category, as certainly towards the end of the 9 years I was PM, I would visit China, and China would always say New Zealand is the country of the three firsts. First to recognise China's market economy status, first Western country to conclude free trade agreement with China, and first country to conclude bilateral accession agreement for WTO with China. And this was felt to be very significant in China. But certainly it was a strategic decision for us to see the immense potential of China as a growth engine for our economy, which we should endeavour to position strategically alongside. So that was my first point. Second point would be to reinforce what David said about the positioning of ASEAN. ASEAN has a very big neighbour, which is China. I think ASEAN sees that if it bulks up, takes Indonesia's 250 million people, Thailand and Vietnam and Philippines roughly 70, 80, 90 million each, plus the remainder of the ASEAN 10, then it has a critical mass, which no individual country has vis-a-vis the big neighbour. And so if it positions as the centre of them concentric circles, it does have some weight and some strategic weight. And it has the +1 relationships, +1 with China, +1 with Japan, +1 with Korea, I guess +1 with India. But it then formed the ASEAN +3, which was separate summit with the 3 +1s together, and then looked for the positioning with the East Asia Summit. With India, obviously, as another major growth engine for them, but also with New Zealand and Australia. And I was part of the advocacy for New Zealand to be part of this concept of an East Asia Summit. Now, since my time in New Zealand, Russia and the United States have since come in, which I think, in a sense, lessens the sense of an East Asia Summit, because it becomes something different. But then again, full of admiration for ASEAN, if you like, in maintaining itself at the centre of that. And I also agree with David that, how ASEAN is developing is certainly a glass more than half full. I used to get a little irritated at quote, the view from London in the media, which was quite disparaging of the ASEAN Charter and the developments. But it is significant when ASEAN takes on human rights, and of course the skeptics could say, well, it took on this charter when Burma was unreconstructed, if you like, but, 5-6 years on, how does that look? Burma is moving. So I think regional organisations setting, if you like, stretch or aspirational targets and principles over time can move people along a spectrum. So I personally think that has been quite important. The last point I was going to make was around transitions, and then reinforcing our discussions last night about them being lengthy processes. I saw a very interesting op-ed to air by Fareed Zakaria when I was on the treadmill a few weeks ago, and he made the point, people are saying, these transitions in the Arab states are very rough, they're very tumultuous, and he said, I want to take you back to what happened in America after the revolution. And he went through what happened to the economy, the society, onto the Civil War, and so on. He said, was this a smooth transition? Absolutely not. He used the French example as well. If we stand back with some historical perspective and look at transitions in the countries today we see as democratic and developed, these were not smooth transitions, and to anticipate that other parts of the world would have transitions which, overwhelmingly peaceful, seamless from one stage to another is not very realistic from that historical perspective.
I think what we're going to do is we're going to move on to John.
One phrase.
One phrase.
One phrase. No, China's rise has encouraged America's return. So the view that somehow China's rise has been to the detriment of the US, was the point I made, is misleading. On the contrary, it has reinforced the American presence.
I think we'll move on to John, because then with the Korean view, we'll be able to get some triangulation on this. Should be very interesting.
Thanks very much. It's a great honour to be here. As a diplomatic historian rather than a political economist, I approach the question in a way slightly from a different angle from some of the previous speakers. But in thinking about Japan and Korea in the broader context of this debate about resilience, I was struck by, I think, 4 themes that perhaps are worth reiterating in the context of Helen Clark's speech. One, the need for a comprehensive approach, and this emphasis on equipping people and infrastructure and communities and institutions to withstand external shocks. Secondly, the focus on governance and capacity building, very critical in the context of how we address the challenges of the DPRK. Thirdly, this important question of going beyond adaptation to systemic shocks and concentrating on prevention. And fourth, the need for strategic engagement and long-term sustained planning. I think if you look at the history of Japan's involvement in East Asia, broadly defined, you can see some elements of some of those themes reflected both in terms of practical policy, but also in terms of the rhetoric that successive Japanese governments have adopted in addressing those challenges. First and foremost, perhaps in terms of its ODA policy, the importance placed on putting the needs of recipient countries first. Secondly, the very clear awareness of the importance of comprehensiveness. Think back to the 1970s, the late 1970s, and the Ohira administration with its policy of comprehensive security, an attempt to marry ODA to wider security objectives, particularly in the context of the US relationship and the Cold War challenges of that era. And thirdly, in the 1990s, the focus, particularly during the administration of Keizo Obuchi, on the concept of human security. All of those are, of course, very positive indicators of the efforts that Japan has made to address these challenges. I'd like to argue, perhaps somewhat contentiously, that if we consider this question of adaptation versus prevention, which we can see, of course, in the context of peacekeeping, or peacekeeping versus peace building, that important distinction, I would argue that there's been, in a sense, a lack of a strategic political culture in Japan. It's made it particularly difficult for the Japanese government to match its delivery to the rhetoric that it's embraced so ambitiously in the past. I'd like to do, in a sense, three things. First of all, to tell you a little bit about how I see the role of Japan and South Korea in attempting to address some of these core security challenges. And then to look at the specific case of North Korea as a state which, in a sense, is emblematic of the challenges that Helen Clark emphasized, of lack of access, lack of transparency, and lack of institutional knowledge in terms of promoting development. And if there is time, and I'm conscious that we're racing against the clock, to say a few words in conclusion about Japan's own resilience in the face of the triple disaster of 3/11. First, on the question of Japan and its broader definition of development and humanitarian needs. The key figure in this context is, of course, Sadako Ogata, former UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and in the mid-1990s, the development of the concept of human security in the context of the UNDP 1994 report. Three core elements came out of Ogata's definition of the term. One, the importance of preventing conflict through peaceful and non-violent means. Secondly, the importance of ensuring that people should have access to human, political, social, economic and cultural rights. And third, very importantly, the importance of the rule of law. Since Ogata's important statement, there have of course been other figures in the Japanese political establishment, people like Tadashi Yamamoto, president of the Japan Center for International Exchange, former Prime Minister Obuchi himself in the late 1990s, who have all reiterated the importance of these themes. However, I think problematic for Japan in this context has been the relative reluctance of other Asian states to prove receptive to the human security concept. Whether it's because of their desire to protect their own political autonomy, the fear of the rise of secessionist movements and the danger that embracing human security in a sense would play to the interests of those groups, or as some people have argued somewhat contentiously, a Confucian-based culture that stresses the primacy of state needs at the expense of the needs of individuals. A lot of that opposition has of course diminished since the late 1990s, partly on the back of the Asian financial crisis, partly with the emergence of new humanitarian challenges that have forced international organizations and other states to intervene in the affairs of states, particularly in Southeast Asia and of course in Indonesia. The key argument today for a comprehensive approach to dealing with both security and development is of course the emergence of increasingly new, powerful challenges that transcend the boundary of the nation state. Most obviously, of course, the threat of nuclear proliferation, and in this context, of course, the threat of North Korea. Climate change, think back to 2008 and Cyclone Nargis, which killed 140,000 people in Myanmar and raised similarly controversial questions about the limits of external intervention. Pandemics and disease, the risk of SARS and Asian flu. The growth of international piracy in Southeast Asia, particularly in the South China and East China Seas. Disruptions to energy and, importantly, to food supplies. In 2007 to 2008, rice prices tripled from $250 to $800 a ton. And as Robert Zellick, I think, very perceptibly observed, the pressure of those economic challenges ran the risk of promoting violent protests in Indonesia, the Philippines, Bangladesh, and India. On top of this, the broader question of economic dislocation, human rights infringements, such as the Chinese crackdown on the Uyghur community in Xinjiang, and of course the broader question of the spread of refugees. How should Asia respond to those challenges? I think part of the problem for Asia has been the lack of an adequate institutional mechanism for addressing these issues, and also the very proliferation of competing Asian regional organizations with unclear demarcation lines in terms of their bureaucratic responsibilities. Japan itself, however, as an individual country, has, I think, contributed constructively to addressing some of those security challenges through a variety of mechanisms, particularly through a more ambitious use of the self-defense forces, dispatching them since the 1990s to a wide variety of geographical centers, East Timor, Aceh, Sri Lanka, the Philippines. Japan, of course, has made much of its role as a natural mediator, brokering the conflict in Cambodia, but also since since 2002 rather, the establishment of a very important post-conflict reconstruction conference to deal with the financial pressures of dealing with Afghanistan. Also very importantly, in May of 2008, former Prime Minister Fukuda announced ambitiously a new Fukuda doctrine, echoing in many ways the political ambitions of his father in the 1970s, with 5 key pledges: a new permanent Japanese representative to ASEAN, the importance of eliminating economic inequality in Southeast Asia, establishing a new disaster management and infectious disease control system in Asia, and also a new concept, seeing the Pacific as, in Fukuta's words, an inland sea, which would embrace the common interests of Japan, China, ASEAN, Australasia, South Korea, Russia, and North America. More recently, we've seen the dispatch of the self-defense forces to the Indian Ocean as part of Operation Enduring Freedom, very ambitious anti-piracy initiatives, the establishment of a new important permanent headquarters in Somalia, more flexible defense coordination with the United States and the establishment of ambitious new defense guidelines, symbolically the relaxation on the export of arms exports to strengthen security cooperation not only with the United States, but with a broader set of allies. And in 2009, in the manifesto of the Democratic Party of Japan, under the leadership of Prime Minister Yukio Hatayama, a commitment to a more ambitious agenda of climate change. But there have been real limits to deliver on this ambitious agenda. The absence of permanent legislation to govern the sending of the SDF overseas, declining budgets, perhaps most importantly, gridlock in the Japanese Diet, with the upper house controlled by the opposition LDP. The perennial merry-go-round of leadership changes, 6 prime ministers in as many years. As a result, out of which have come growing public disaffection with mainstream politics and the emergence of new rival politicians who embrace a more nationalistic agenda. For South Korea, we've seen, I think, again in rhetorical terms, like Japan, an ambitious commitment to activism in developing a broader approach to security and development needs. A clear expression of this has been President Lee's commitment to a vision of South Korea as a global power, a re-strengthened ROK-US partnership symbolized perhaps most powerfully by the recent Nuclear Security Summit in Seoul, active use of peacekeeping operations in Lebanon and Iraq, dramatic anti-piracy initiatives in which South Korean forces have been deployed to real effectiveness, joining the Proliferation Security Initiative in 2009 to address the challenge of North Korea, expanding ROK spending on overseas development assistance, and also, perhaps most importantly, the President's signature Green Growth Initiative. South Korea has also joined the Asia-Pacific Partnership on Clean Development and Climate Change. However, there are, I think, again, important limits to the ability of South Korea to realize this ambitious agenda, not least because of domestic politics. We've seen in the recent National Assembly elections an important shift in the focus of both main political parties, with the stress on social equality and narrowing the gap between the haves and the have-nots in South Korean society. This may in turn persuade the South Korean electorate to focus much more on domestic issues and move away from a concentration on foreign affairs. Arguably, the key area of opportunity for South Korea, one would expect, would be to focus on the humanitarian and development challenge of North Korea. But here I think the South Korean record is curiously unsuccessful and disappointing. Perhaps it's worthwhile to set out the core challenges that North Korea faces. Food insecurity, the consequence of the famine of the 1990s, which killed as many as between 600,000 and 1 million North Koreans, and in the process displaced some 30% of the North Korean population. On top of which, according to the World Food Programme, 25% of children in North Korea suffer from acute malnourishment. The second challenge of housing and environmental security, partly the product of damaging floods in the 1990s and more recently. In 2007, no fewer than 102,000 North Koreans were displaced from their homes. Thirdly, worsening healthcare provision, somewhat ironic considering the early effort by the North Korean state to focus on universal healthcare and a focus on disease prevention. The system now, of course, has collapsed, and problems such as malaria and tuberculosis represent a recurring and perhaps systemic problem in the north, with high mortality rates for infants and pregnant mothers. Fourthly, the problem of refugees, whether it's internal migration brought about by some of that economic hardship in the 1990s, migration to China, with some people reporting anywhere as 30 to 50,000 North Koreans moving across the border with China during the 1990s, and of course the constant challenge of coping with North Korean refugees moving not only through China but further south towards South Korea, the South Korean government having to adapt to accommodate some 2,000 refugees on an annual basis. And of course, the great reversal. Up until the 1970s, of course, North Korea's economic growth rate was ahead of that of South Korea. Now, of course, the statistics are much more sobering. South Korea is 30 times larger than North Korea in terms of its economic capabilities. And of course, this has raised real serious concerns about how best to deal with the long-term perennial challenge of unification. On top of which we have human rights abuses, and perhaps most importantly in the context of this discussion, growing evidence of institutional failure and the weakness of government central control in North Korea. The reforms of 2002, partial economic liberalisation, the botched currency reform of 2008, have pointed out, I think, the limitations of North Korean central government economic planning and its ability to engage with economic reform. Reports from refugees, particularly reports promoted by the Ministry of Unification in South Korea, have highlighted what many people point to as an emerging grey economy in North Korea, a willingness on the part of the central state to relax control, as in the face of these economic challenges, more and more individuals begin to moonlight to take new jobs, but in the process this is creating real new social challenges in North Korea. A rise in divorce rates, as women are forced to travel large distances in North Korea in order to find food and to engage in crude market activity. Growing economic equality between haves and have-nots, particularly within Pyongyang, where the privileged members of the elite are increasingly benefiting from the greater freedom that the government has de facto provided. And also importantly, people talk about the importance of civil society in North Korea. And of course the evidence suggests that there's precious little civil society in the north. But economic protest is beginning, and economic pressure is beginning to change that dynamic. In 2008, the government interestingly introduced new legislation designed to try and restrict the activity of women working in the market sector. Very strikingly, many of those women, in the face of that pressure, decided to protest against the government and to take real risks in terms of their own personal security, counterfeiting birth certificates and marriage certificates in order to gain the legitimacy and the public acceptability that they could continue to work in this industry. The solutions in dealing with the North Korean challenge are limited. South Koreans' record, as I said, has been disappointing, notwithstanding the rhetoric of Lee Myung-bak, who when he came to power talked importantly of a Marshall Aid plan for North Korea, stressing the importance of 5 core areas of development assistance, promoting industrial change, educational reform, economic development more broadly, energy, transport and communications, as well as welfare assistance. But of course the stumbling block in all of this has been the nuclear issue and the conditionality that South Korea has attached to its aid program towards the North. One area of possible opportunity for bilateral cooperation between the two Koreas is in the area of sustainable development. And it's worth looking back 2 years ago in the New Year's public address of the North Korean government, when a clear commitment was made by the government of the day to promote sustainable development. The idea of green growth might seem attractive to a North Korean leadership that fights shy of the idea of market reform because of its fear that this will in turn promote political change that will be destabilized. An authoritarian government, in a sense, doesn't have to deal with the challenge of public opinion and therefore can embrace a very ambitious green growth agenda. And of course, in an ideal world, could benefit from the technological advances of South Korea. Other options include, at least in terms of the wider international community, not just South Korea, extrapolating from the experiences of successful NGOs that have done business with the North Korean regime. And an interesting report from the medical sector in 2009 demonstrated, I think, 3 key important features that have been cited by those people who worked closely with North Korean agencies. One, the desire for autonomy on the part of the North Korean administration. And one mechanism for addressing that might be some system of joint monitoring. Secondly, the importance of residential status, to provide that long-term continuity on the part of NGOs and to give them the knowledge that's necessary in order to address the North Korean challenges. And thirdly, at least from North Korea's perspective, the contentious question of delinking these initiatives from human rights questions. Where long-term contact and long-term development is an issue, we have a very powerful example, of course, in the Kaesong Industrial Development Zone, which has provided employment, guaranteed income, regulated working hours, and healthcare for no fewer than 40,000 North Koreans. There's also, I think, important areas for cooperation in the technical field. And here the initiatives of individual universities, both in the United States, Syracuse University, which has been working to promote technology and information cooperation with North Korea, is worth citing. But above all, I think we need a better understanding of the decision-making process in North Korea. Patrick McCatherine, a US political analyst, has attempted to begin to understand and unpack the balance between the 3 competing agencies of power within North Korea, the military, the party, and the state. But there's still very much that we don't know about the precise mechanism of decision-making, magnified and reinforced, of course, by the transition we've seen since December. A final area, which is an area close to my heart, is educational exchange. And here I think some of the non-traditional actors who have a stake in what's happening on the Korean Peninsula are worth citing. Most importantly, the role of our own government in providing educational scholarships to North Koreans. This year, for the first time, we were able to accept 3 North Korean students in Cambridge. It is very much early days in the process, but I think the message that we're hearing from North Koreans, that they have a desire, genuine desire, to learn about economic reform, even at the cost to their own personal security, I think is something that we ought to take comfort from. There's a lot more I could say about the issue of Japan and resilience, but I think given the pressure of time, I'll end there.
Thanks very much, John. Some questions to John?
I have a question to David's presentation. Well, the fate of the Soviet Union and the Arab Spring basically remind us that we may be, academics and politicians alike, that we may be overstated the stability of autocratic regimes. So my question to you, are we now overstating China's stability?
Joker. I'm not a China specialist. Certainly, democratic regimes have a capacity to rebound. That's what that authoritarian regimes do not. And yes, China's specialists will talk about a degree of stability or instability when a regime requires 10% growth rates in order to maintain itself in power, or sees the needs to maintain those 10% growth rates. The concerns I expressed coming from Southeast Asia about growing Chinese nationalism, communism as a mobilizing myth no longer excites the population. Becoming rich, what is it, Deng Xiaoping, whether the cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice, that is something more, but that as a mobilizing myth is not terribly exciting either. So what is left? Patriotism, the last refuge of scoundrels, I think was Samuel Johnson once put it. So yes, there is some concern about the stability of the communist one-party state. However, we do have a capacity in the Chinese Communist Party for instituting its own internal reforms, which shouldn't be neglected either.
Just make a brief comment on this very important presentation from John. Firstly, on Japan's vision for the region, I hadn't picked up on the inland sea reference, but was very much aware right through the first decade of the 2000s of its interests in seeing an inclusive East Asian community. It always was very much for a wider East Asia summit, which would bring in, I guess, the counterbalancing forces of Australasia in the south, India to the west, and of course now as the summits developed, the US back in and Russia as well. Secondly, on Korea and its positioning, there was one more ingredient I was going to add to that. The hosting of the Busan summit on aid effectiveness, and Korea, to the best of my knowledge, being the only developing country to have formally graduated itself out of developing country status, if you like, not only into OECD, because others have gone into OECD, Mexico, Chile, but formally into the DAC, the Development Assistance Community. So it has taken a very deliberate course which has positioned it with developed countries, and as you said, is growing its development assistance budget. That's growing exponentially from a very small base, but it is growing. And then to North Korea, and just to reinforce what I said before, that North Korea, like Burma, has been a country where UNDP has faced a very restrictive mandate for these geopolitical reasons played out on our board. which more or less have restricted it to a humanitarian plus type program, where you can't have much of an impact working at the national level to support reform, which I agree with John. I think there is some interest in parts of the North Korea establishment. At one point, when we were working up a country program, one of the initiatives in it was an interest in North Korea in having people learn a little bit more about global trade and how others had taken tentative steps to get into the global economy, etc. But that very specific program, in effect, ran into a veto from major players on our board. They saw that as going right outside the humanitarian plus sort of category. So that's been a bit frustrating. And I agree with you. We do need a better analysis of the different centres of power in the country. Take, for example, developments which followed one on the other in the last few weeks, where meeting in Beijing, as I recall, the United States and North Korean negotiators reached agreement around, I think, the nuclear issue, which led the US to say that food aid could resume. The negotiators from the government of North Korea were barely home, and in effect the military announced the rocket launch, which made it looked like what had been agreed in Beijing somehow wasn't agreed in good faith. I don't think we should draw that conclusion. I think we should say there are different centres of power, and they're not necessarily as coordinated as one would assume with a regime of the nature of North Korea. So I simply make that observation.
Actually, I do not have any specific question. I want to use a little bit of my understanding about the talk. I'm quite interested in the talk today, and especially the talk given by Professor David and Professor Robert, because they are all mentioned about the China and Chinese. And as a Chinese, I'm quite proud of the China's development. And also, I found more and more scholars are more interested in China and China's development. And also, quite interesting is the metaphor that Professor David said, the dragon hugging, or the metaphor of the mother-in-law, the relationship. That's quite interesting to me. And also about the Professor Robert, you mentioned about the development of, or the positive or negative influence about China, and from maybe the economic development and also the political development. I don't want to comment more about this, only I want to say, as a Chinese scholar, and I'm learning about the American, the British literature and culture, but I found really it's quite different when you are living in a place. Like now I'm living in Cambridge. It's quite different from what I learned in the textbook or in my research. So I just want to emphasize that if we can understand more about each other, maybe the development will be, the whole development of the world will be more harmoniously, and the world will become more beautiful. Yeah, anyway, thank you very much for your interest in China. Thank you.
Quick comment.
Yeah, just on the question of China's foreign relations, we haven't mentioned the elephant in the room.
Which goes with the panda and
the elephant in the room, of course, is the elephant is Iceland. And I just want to draw your attention to a really interesting development, which is that over the past 5 and more years, China has been really building up its relationship with Iceland to the point where, for example, China put its full diplomatic weight, both publicly and, more importantly, privately, behind Iceland's bid for a Security Council seat in the 2008 election. The problem was that the election happened 3 weeks after October 2008, when Iceland became synonymous with failure. And so Iceland lost the election against the candidacy of Turkey and Austria. But in any case, you may ask why, and why China is cozying up to Iceland. The reason is because China has a very clear strategy for the melting of the Arctic ice, to send giant container ships, much bigger than the present ones. The present ones are 400 meters. China's planning on 500-meter container ships through the Arctic for a substantial part of the year. These ships are so big that the cargoes have to be transshipped. The question is, where will the transshipment port be based and who will build it? And China sees Iceland right at the mouth of the Arctic Ocean, very good location for building a transshipment port. China has lots of people keen to build the port in Iceland, and the Icelandic government is very attracted to this idea, but it's not at all keen on having lots and thousands of Chinese come to Iceland to help build the port. And so this is quite an issue that's rumbling in the background, and again, if any of you are looking for dissertation topics.
I was going to say, from a British perspective, it's fortunate these developments hadn't occurred during the Cod Wars.
Yes.
Perhaps a question for Helen. What do you think of the current controversy in New Zealand about the selling of private land, I'm referring to the Quaker farms, to China? Do you think it is do you think New Zealand conducts enough strategic planning under the current regime, or do you think it's just sort of walking into things blind?
You know, I've made a practice of trying not to get quoted in New Zealand on New Zealand matters for quite some time now, but I make this point that you do need an Overseas Investment Act, and you do need criteria, and you do need a clear sense of what your national interest is. There is a tension between those who own land and want to maximise the price for it, and those who feel that if you let a price maximisation strategy run, then farm ownership will forever pass out of the possibility of the young New Zealander who wants to pursue that way of earning a living. And the only other comment I'll make is that in my time, quite a controversial decision came up on whether, in effect, Auckland International Airport should be sold. And we took a strategic view to, as our ministers did, to knock back the sale, which the bureaucrats had advised favourably for, because that seemed to be their general disposition.
Sale to whom?
UAE.
Oh, wow.
But, you know, from a national strategic interest perspective, Auckland International Airport is the second biggest hub in Australasia after Sydney. And we have to guard that. Otherwise, Auckland International Airport will become simply a feeder airport for other more important airports. You could see Brisbane built up at Auckland's expense. You could see Melbourne built up at Auckland's expense. So to retain hub status, we have to have very clear national interest, which in my view would rule out ever selling to companies which had a major stake in the East Australia area. So, you know, a clear sense of national strategic interest is needed when it comes to what are inevitably strategic assets, and there are special criteria in the New Zealand overseas investment regime which deal with rural land. And in order to justify a sale of rural land, there has to be some demonstrated advantage from the sale into foreign hands over what a local buyer could provide. And really the CRASSH case rests on, well, what was that demonstrated advantage? And it fell over. Interestingly, the legal challenge to it came from someone with very deep pockets, which was Michael Fay. But that's another longer story.
I think at this point we're going to say three things. First of all, we're going to remind you that at 5 o'clock tonight, Helen will be giving her last lecture in this series, and hope to see that. Secondly, that afterwards there's lunch outside where we can continue the discussion and the conversation. And thirdly, to thank our excellent speakers for a really, really interesting symposium today.